Deputy Catherine Connolly.
And I welcome the opportunity to speak on this important matter. I want to thank Deputy Collins and his colleagues for bringing this, and I fully support it. And they have highlighted the crisis that the industry is in and the urgent need, and they've identified a figure which, in the scheme of money given out by the government, often unaccounted for and often without transparency and accountability coming back. This is very, very different. And your comments that it's the first time that a group has brought a private members' bill is not helpful, because small groups can only bring private members' bills on an irregular, let's say on a very intermittent basis. And if I use myself as an example, I've brought bills or motions on seaweed, on a policy for the islands. Nothing has happened, and they're all interlinked, of course. We've had one on wool, interlinked again with local industry, the viability of coastal communities, seaweed, wool, fishing, and a policy for the islands. None of them have materialised, not one of them, and we're waiting. And so I welcome the positives, First Minister, before I go on to analyse where I see the difficulties with the government. I welcome the announcement that there's a National Inshore Fishermen's Association recognised as a producer organisation. Of course, the value of that will depend on its total independence from the department and its total independence in relation to resourcing. Now, I hope that producer organisation doesn't have the distinction of standing over the death of fishing in our coastal areas. I hope that's not the outcome. The motion is particularly well laid out. It sets out in detail, and I thank Deputy Collins for that. And what I want to focus in on is in relation to the inshore fishing, the very good policy by the government back in 2018 to ban trawlers over 18 metres from the inshore. A wonderful policy. Now, it has already been referred to by Deputy Cairns, but the update hasn't been given at all. So just very quickly, ye bring in a very good policy. You give a transition period for the bigger trawlers in relation to sprat. You give them a 2 or 3 year window to get out of the inshore waters. And unfortunately, a case is taken to the High Court by a number of big boat owners, and they win on a technicality. The technicality simply being that the communication process wasn't as it should be. Fast forward to this year to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal has held completely with the government. And it's worth, this is the Court of Appeal judgment. I've taken the trouble to read it in detail, and on the 19th of July 22, they held with the government's policy utterly and completely. Now, can you tell me today what has happened since the 18th of July? The only little obstacle at the bottom of that judgment was the court asked for submissions in relation to a Northern Ireland aspect and Northern Ireland vehicles. Otherwise, it has been a complete victory for the government. Their policy has been upheld. More particularly, the Court of Appeal said the policy directive to exclude the big trawlers from taking sprat on a basis that is simply not viable was a measure of the conservation for fish stocks within the relevant regulation. The failure to notify, and that's the consultation process, had no effect on the validity. Win-win for the government. The policy directive, the policy was not discriminatory. It was intra-virus. In other words, you had the power to do what you did. It wasn't irrational, it was rational. It was legally adequate, and a reasonable leader construing the consultation paper would not have concluded that the applicants, the people who took the case, enjoyed any right to a second consultation. So no need for a second consultation. Your policy has been upheld, and simply 7 months later, we've no clarification from you on a matter that's so important. The unsustainable removal of sprat from our inshore waters that's making it impossible for you smaller fishermen to continue. And if we look at the policy and what was behind it, there was a 6-fold justification for it, which I won't read out, only some of it, to provide wider ecosystem benefits, including for nursing areas and juvenile stocks. And it goes on to outline all of them. Excluding vessels over 18 metres from trawling inside the 6 nautical mile zone would present a significant economic opportunity to smaller inshore vessels. The increase in availability of sprat and possibly of herring to smaller vessels would represent a significant diversification opportunity for these smaller vessels. There were potential knock-on benefits for other economic sectors if the restrictions were introduced, which is what the government were doing back in December 18. And finally, the restrictions ultimately reflected the policy directive would go to some way to addressing the issue of gear conflict, in that the loss of the static fishing gear used by smaller vessels as a consequence of net trawling by larger boats. Background and the evidence given, which wasn't challenged by the government, was that the number of vessels in the 12 to 18 metre fleet in Ireland is very low and continues to decline, reflecting the very difficult environment in which these small boats operate, which is the whole substance of this motion before us today. There is a compelling case for excluding trawling activity by large vessels in coastal waters inside the 6 nautical miles. There are sufficient opportunities for these vessels outside of the 6 nautical miles, and on it goes, and it talks about the importance of small fishermen earning a living that's sustainable in small vessels in a sustainable way. That's what this motion is about. And what really worries me is your sort of quick retort, and I can see why you might retort to some of the language used, but that's neither here nor there. The duty is on you to come forward to tell us what you're doing in terms of policy and an action plan so that we have sustainable coastal communities based on seaweed, which is the most fantastic product that we're ignoring until we give it to the big boys, or to be fair, to the big girls. Wool. An absolute wonderful, what did we do? Somebody should set up a wool council. We set up a report, fantastic recommendations, highlights the diversity of how wool can be used, and then we ignore it. And what do we do with small vessels? We make it absolutely impossible for them. And when we bring in a policy directive, we let it trundle on for 4 years through the courts without making a damning case or a strong case to the court to say, please, hear this quickly. And when they did hear it in July, they gave you a win. And you're making the win a loss because you're still allowing the big trawlers into the 6 mile area to fish unsustainably for sprat that's going to feed other unsustainable fish farming activities. So, Minister, I have no hesitation in supporting this motion today. I want to thank the rural group again for bringing it, and the comments in relation to we should bring these motions in our time is simply not helpful. The duty is on ye to tell us what the policy is.
Thank you.